Good evening and welcome back to Bedtime in History. Tonight's journey takes us into one of the world's oldest and most enduring civilizations, China. Stretching across millennia, its story is not only a record of dynasties and rulers, but also of rivers and soils, of inventions and philosophies, of struggle and renewal. From the first footprints pressed into the fertile banks of the Yellow River to the crowded skylines of today, the history of China is a continuous thread woven from myth, memory, and survival. It is a story that shaped Asia, influenced the world, and still echoes through the rhythms of daily life. Before we move further, allow me this quick moment. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, post your location and the local time in the comments. It is always wonderful to know from where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of China begins not with emperors or palaces, but with hunters and gatherers. Archaeological evidence shows that by around 2.5 million years ago, early hominins already roamed East Asia, a Jacuzzian near modern Beijing. Traces of Homo erectus reveal a presence as far back as 750,000 years ago. Stone tools, charred bones, and remnants of fire pits remain, showing adaptation to the harsh winters of northern Asia. These were not yet Chinese in culture, but they formed the biological and environmental foundation for later societies. As the Ice Age retreated around 10,000 BCE, rivers such as the Yangtze and the Yellow provided fertile corridors for settlement with warmer climates, wild grains and millet grew, and people began to cultivate them. Huts with thatched roofs appeared, and families stored food for later seasons. This fragile but vital step marked the beginning of agriculture. Daily life was perilous. Exposure, disease, and floods ended lives suddenly. It is a simple reality that most of us carried from our modern world into that one would struggle to last even a few nights. By 7000 BCE, people along the Yellow River ground millet into flour, stored it in clay jars, and painted red designs on pottery. In the south, along the Yangtze, rice cultivation spread across wetlands. Families raised pigs and dogs, wore baskets, and placed tools and ornaments with the dead. These gestures reflected both survival and an early concern for ritual and meaning. Over time, scattered hamlets turned into broader cultures. One of the earliest, the Yangshao, around 5,000–30,000 BCE, spread across the central plains. They built semi-subterranean homes, dug communal storage pits, and relied on seasonal rhythms of farming. Pottery adorned with swirls, fish, and geometric forms shows both artistry and the beginnings of symbolic thought. Later, the Longshan culture around 3900 BCE developed further east. Their black pottery was so fine it appears almost translucent. Settlements grew larger, surrounded by rammed earth walls. These fortifications, along with evidence of weapons, reveal a society becoming more stratified and more prepared for organized conflict. Community leadership was shifting from loose kin groups toward hierarchical structures with greater authority. The Yellow River shaped these lives. Its floods often destroyed entire villages. Yet the same floods left fertile silt that sustained farming. This duality, destructive yet sustaining, became a theme that echoed through centuries of Chinese philosophy, which emphasized balance, harmony, and resilience in the face of shifting fortune. By 2000 BCE, village life had matured into larger, more complex societies. Bronze metallurgy began to appear, Jade ornaments circulated across regions, and oral traditions preserved the memory of ancient leaders. Chinese legends speak of sage kings Yao Shun and Yu the Great, who were remembered not only for rule but for their moral character and ability to control floods. Whether these figures lived exactly as told remains uncertain, but they embody a cultural conviction. Leadership required virtue and ritual, not only strength. From these stories and material remains, the idea of the Xia Dynasty emerges. Traditionally dated to around 210–0600 BCE, the Xia is remembered as China's first dynasty. Archaeology provides clues but not certainty. Sites at early II with palatial buildings and bronze workshops may reflect this dynasty. Whether Shirao was an actual political entity or partly legendary, it marks the symbolic transition from prehistory into history. Thus, at the close of this first chapter, we stand in the Yellow River Valley during the early Bronze Age. Communities have grown from scattered huts into fortified towns. Agriculture sustains families. Ritual defines meaning, and myths shape memory. The earliest outlines of Chinese civilization take form. A people bound by land and river, tempered by hardship and already reaching toward continuity that would last thousands of years. Neolithic village life. The age that followed the Ice Age in China brought more than just warmer seasons and retreating glaciers. It carried with it the profound shift from wandering survival to settled life across the valleys of the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south. Small clusters of humans began to root themselves into the soil. They were no longer only hunters following herds or gatherers collecting wild fruits. They were farmers, builders, and ritual makers. These communities of the Neolithic period, stretching from around 10,000 BCE to 2000 BCE, formed the base upon which the grand edifice of Chinese civilization would one day stand. The Yellow River region, with its deep loess soils, offered a canvas for early agriculture. The earth was soft, easily worked with polished stone tools, and its floods deposited fertile silt. Families here turned increasingly to millet, a grain that tolerated the dry northern climate. By around 7000 BCE. They were grinding it into coarse flour, shaping it into flat cakes, or boiling it into nourishing porridge. This was the food that sustained the body and set the rhythm of labor, planting in spring, tending through summer, and harvesting before the harsh winter winds swept across the plains. Far to the south, along the lush wetlands of the Yangtze River, people discovered the power of rice cultivation. Unlike millet, rice demanded the mastery of water. Fields were deliberately flooded, seedlings transplanted, and harvests gathered in the humidity of summer. This agricultural system was labor-intensive, but the yields were generous. By 5000 BCE, rice farming in communities such as the Himudu had become the backbone of their diet. The contrast between millet in the north and rice in the south would shape not only diets but also regional identities in China for thousands of years. The houses of these Neolithic communities tell us how they lived. In the north, villages often built semi-upturned homes, circular or square, dug into the ground to retain warmth in the freezing winters. Wooden beams supported roofs layered with thatch. Inside hearths burned through the day and smoke blackened the ceilings. Stone mortars ground grain. Clay jars stored water and millet. Bone needles sewed skins into clothing. In the south, in wetter climates, homes were often raised on stilts above marshland, keeping floors dry and safe from flooding. Wooden planks formed walls and woven mats provided bedding. Everywhere life was simple, laborious, and yet increasingly tied to rhythm, stability, and memory. Archaeology reveals that dogs and pigs were among the first domesticated animals. serving both as food and as companions within the villages. Over time, water buffalo and chickens would join this growing menagerie. Tools were fashioned from polished stone axes, sickles and adzes that cut wood, harvested crops and cleared land. Pottery fired in rudimentary kilns became indispensable for storing food and water. At first thick and utilitarian, pottery grew more refined with painted decorations that reflected both artistry and an emerging symbolic world. Burials reveal even deeper truths. Many graves contain not only the body of the deceased, but also goods. Pottery jars filled with food, jade ornaments, bone tools. Infants were sometimes buried beneath the floors of homes, perhaps to keep them close in the spirit world. The dead were not abandoned. They were integrated into the life of the living. This practice hints at the earliest roots of ancestor reverence, a belief that would later dominate Chinese culture that the departed remain present, shaping the fortune of the living through unseen influence. Among the most significant cultures of this period was the Yang Shao, flourishing between 5000 and 30,000 BCE. Their villages stretched across the Central Plains, and their pottery remains among the most distinctive of the era. Painted with bold red and black designs, swirls, zigzags, fish, and birds, these vessels reveal more than decoration. They reveal a mind turning symbolic, seeing patterns in the world and embedding them in daily tools. At Banu near modern Xiani, archaeologists uncovered one of the most remarkable Yangsha villages, with over 100 houses arranged around a central meeting hall. Bampo shows us a community that valued collective life. Kilns fired pottery, storage pits held surplus grain, and workshops crafted bone tools. Graves scattered around the settlement reveal a society still relatively egalitarian. Wealth was not yet concentrated in a few hands. Interestingly, many female burials contained elaborate goods, suggesting that women held central roles in society, possibly tracing descent through maternal lines. While the Yangsha flourished in the north, the Himudu culture arose in the lower Yang Valley. Their homes on stilts looked out over wetlands thick with reeds. Rice paddies stretched across the landscape, tended with bone spades and wooden plows. Himud villagers were cloth from hemp, carved wooden tools, and created pottery that was dark, often undecorated, but strong. They also practiced shamanistic rituals, evidence of drums, tomite carvings, and communal rituals points to a world where nature and spirit were inseparably entwined. By 3000 BCE, the Longshan culture emerged, bridging the Neolithic and Bronze Age. Their pottery was unlike anything before, black, thin-walled, and polished to a sheen. These vessels required advanced kilns and skilled potters, suggesting growing specialization of labor. Longshan settlements grew larger and more organized, often surrounded by rammed earth walls. These fortifications mark a turning point. They speak of conflict, defense, and the rise of leaders who could command collective labor. Within Longshan graves, disparities also appear. Some were modest, containing only basic goods, while others were rich with jade ornaments and fine pottery. This inequality signals the dawn of social stratification and the beginnings of hierarchy. Across both Yellow and Yangtze valleys, these Neolithic cultures forged connections through trade. Jade ornaments polished to a luminous green traveled hundreds of kilometers. Ideas, tools, and crops crossed from region to region. Over generations, villages became networks, and networks became protoates. Oral traditions preserved memories of leaders who tamed floods or brought order to the people. The mythic figures of Yao Shun and Yu the Great belong to this world half-remembered, half-imagined, yet deeply influential. They represented not only rulers but ideals, virtue, ritual, and the harmony of humanity with the forces of heaven and earth. The rivers shaped every aspect of this life. The Yellow River, known even then for its devastating floods, could obliterate villages in hours. Yet it also nourished the soil, forcing resilience and rebuilding. The Yangtze, vast and humid, supported denser agriculture, but demanded careful mastery of water. These rivers taught that survival was not a matter of dominance over nature, but of balance with it. This sense of balance born in the fields and floods of the Neolithic would echo in later philosophies: Taoist thought, Confucian order, and the yin-yang duality of Chinese cosmology. By 2000 BCE, as Neolithic life matured into the Bronze Age, the essentials of Chinese culture were already in place. Agriculture tied people to the land. Pottery and jade connected them to both utility and beauty. Ritual bound the living to the dead. Leadership was crystallizing into authority, and myths had begun to define what made a ruler legitimate. The foundations of continuity, family reverence, communal labor, moral leadership were established long before dynasties carved their names into history. This was the Neolithic village life of China, modest in material wealth, but rich in resilience and meaning. It was here in painted pottery and flooded rice paddies, in ancestor graves and fortified walls, that the essence of Chinese civilization began to take form. From this soil, the first dynasty would soon rise, blurring the boundary between legend and history. The next chapter opens with the enigmatic memory of the Xia Dynasty, remembered as the dawn of rule in China. Xia's elusive beginnings as the Neolithic period gave way to a new age of metallurgy, fortified settlements, and emerging hierarchy. The memory of China's first dynasty took shape. It is called the Xia, and it occupies a fascinating space between history and legend. For later generations, the Xia was the dawn of dynastic rule, the moment when families and villages became a kingdom. Yet for modern historians, it remains one of the most debated chapters of China's past. Partly myth, partly archaeological reality, and wholly essential to the cultural identity of China. The Xia dynasty is traditionally dated from around 200 to 1600 BCE, said to have ruled in the heart of the Yellow River Valley. Later chronicles, most famously the records of the grand historian written by Sima Qian during the Han Dynasty, described a succession of Xia rulers beginning with Yu the Great, a semi-divine figure celebrated for his mastery over floods. The Yellow River, unpredictable and destructive, defined the very possibility of civilization in northern China. To tame its waters was to demonstrate a power both human and cosmic. Yu the Great's story is central. According to legend, he was tasked with controlling the devastating floods that drowned villages and ruined harvests. Where others before him had failed, Yu succeeded not by blocking the waters, but by channeling them. He ordered dikes and canals to be dug, diverting floods into irrigation. This approach, working with the natural force rather than against it, became a metaphor for the ideal ruler, one who harmonized human society with the rhythms of heaven and earth. The tale of Yu was retold across dynasties, a moral lesson that the right to rule was inseparable from the ability to care for the land and its people. Beyond Yu, the Xia rulers were said to have established palaces, organized armies, and developed rituals that gave coherence to their kingdom. The dynasty supposedly lasted through 14 kings across nearly 5 centuries, but no written records survive from the Xia themselves. All accounts come from much later, compiled by Zhou and Han historians who looked backward to explain the origins of order. This makes the Xia less a fully documented state and more a remembered foundation myth written into history to create continuity from the earliest times. And yet, archaeology complicates the story. Excavations at Eritu in Henan province reveal an advanced culture flourishing between 1900 and 1500 BCE. Palatial buildings, bronze workshops, and evidence of organized urban planning appear at this site. Jade ornaments, turquoise inlays, and ceremonial vessels point to a society with hierarchy and ritual. Could Erto be the Xia Dynasty? Many scholars think so, suggesting that the memory of the sea aligns with this archaeological culture. Others remain cautious, noting that while early Toito is real, whether it corresponds exactly to the essay of legend cannot be proven. Regardless, early demonstrates that by this era, China had entered a new stage. Bronze casting was practiced here, though still in early forms. Workshops produced ritual vessels, axes, and weapons. Objects that required specialized labor and centralized control. Large rammed earth foundations mark palatial complexes, showing the presence of a ruling elite. Roads and planned layouts suggest deliberate urban design. These are the hallmarks of statehood, an authority capable of commanding labor and resources across a region. The Xia, real or not, became more than a dynasty. It became a cultural anchor. Later, dynasties used it to justify their own legitimacy, presenting themselves as inheritors of the order first established by Yu and his descendants. In the Zhou Dynasty, for instance, the idea of the mandate of heaven was developed. The belief that rulers governed with the blessing of cosmic order, but that this blessing could be withdrawn if they failed. By tracing this principle back to Yu and the Xia, later rulers placed themselves in an unbroken line of moral authority. Life in Xia times, reconstructed from Iolito and other sites, was a mixture of subsistence farming and growing complexity. Millet remained the staple crop in the north. Farmers used stone and early bronze tools to clear fields and harvest grain. Pigs, dogs, cattle, and sheep were domesticated, supplementing diets of millet grl and stewed meat. Villages expanded into towns with specialized crafts, potters, weavers, and bronze workers. Society was stratified elites, lived in palatial compounds, and were buried with jade and bronze, while commoners left simpler graves. Rituals played a central role. Bronze vessels, even in their early forms, were not mere cooking pots. They were sacred objects used in ceremonies honoring ancestors and deities. In these rituals, the living sought favor and guidance from the spirits of the dead, reinforcing both social order and the idea of continuity across generations. The seeds of Chinese statecraft lay here. Power was not only political but sacred, legitimized through ritual and cosmic alignment. The transition from Neolithic village life to the Xia era represents one of the most significant shifts in human history. The birth of kingship, centralized authority, and organized society. It marks the moment when small communities bound to land and river were drawn into something larger. A kingdom that claimed to unify not just territory but cosmic order. Whether fully historical or partly legendary, the Xia embodies the idea that China's civilization was ancient, continuous, and divinely sanctioned. The Xia story also reflects the deep cultural need for beginnings. Just as Greece had its myths of heroic ages and Mesopotamia its stories of divine kings, China placed the Xia at the root of its tree of history. The details may blur, but the symbolic power endures. Yu, the Great, guiding waters into channels, became the archetype of the ruler as harmonizer, the bringer of order to a chaotic world. By the time the Xia supposedly gave way to the Shang around 1600 BCE, the structures of dynastic rule were firmly in place. Bronze casting, ancestor rituals, fortified towns, and ruling elites were now part of the landscape. The Shang Dynasty would leave clearer records inscribed on bones and bronze, but their foundations rested on the soil prepared in the Xia age. Thus, this elusive dynasty hovering between archaeology and myth occupies a unique role. It is less about verifying every detail and more about understanding what the Xia meant to those who remembered it. It meant origins, legitimacy, and continuity. And in China, where the weight of the past has always carried into the present, that meaning was as real as stone palaces and bronze vessels. From the villages of Yangsha and Longshan to the palatial compounds of Eritu, the arc of development was unmistakable. Agriculture, craft, hierarchy, and ritual had grown together into the earliest form of statehood. The Xia, elusive though it is, symbolizes that threshold. It is the bridge from scattered Neolithic communities to the unmistakable roar of Bronze Age civilization. As we leave this chapter, the scene is set for what comes next. The Shang Dynasty, China's first dynasty, firmly etched into history, whose oracle bones and bronze vessels will speak to us directly across 3,000 years. Shang oracle bones. With the Shah fading into the mist of memory and archaeology, the next dynasty emerges with firmer ground beneath its feet. The Shang Dynasty, traditionally dated from around 1600 to 146 BCE, stands as the first in Chinese history to leave behind a body of direct evidence: inscriptions, bronzes, and royal tombs. At last, the voices of ancient rulers and their divers reach us across the centuries, carved into the very bones of animals and the shells of turtles. The Shang may not have been the first state, but they are the first that can be seen, touched, and read. The Shang heartland lay in the central plains of the Yellow River Valley, especially around modern-day Henan. Here, a network of cities rose, each ruled by powerful kings who claimed both military and spiritual authority. Their capitals shifted over time, but one of the most famous was Anyang in the north of Hunan, where the late Shang Dynasty flourished. Archaeological work there has uncovered palaces, bronze foundries, workshops, and enormous royal tombs. In these remains lies the earliest recorded chapter of Chinese statecraft. The defining feature of the Shang Dynasty was the rise of bronze metallurgy. Using advanced casting techniques, artisans created vessels of extraordinary size and complexity. These bronzes were not everyday objects. They were ritual instruments made to hold wine, food, or offerings to the ancestors and gods. Some vessels bear intricate decorations of Taoidi masks, stylized animal faces, symmetrical and haunting. Staring back from the surface of the bronze, these designs carried symbolic meaning, connecting the earthly realm with the spiritual. The Shang believed that ancestors continued to influence the living. To maintain harmony and secure favor, they performed elaborate rituals. Food, wine, and sometimes even human sacrifices were offered. The bronzes themselves were buried with kings and nobles, ensuring that the power of ritual carried into the afterlife. Tombs uncovered at Anyang contain hundreds of such vessels along with jade ornaments, chariots, and the remains of sacrificed servants or captives. These burials reflect a world in which hierarchy was absolute, and kings carried their court into death as into life. It is from these rituals that the Shang left their most famous legacy, the oracle bones. These were shoulder blades of oxen or prawns of turtles carved with questions for the spirits. Divers would inscribe queries onto the bone requests about harvests, weather, wars, childbirth, and the king's fortune. The bone was then heated until it cracked, and the pattern of cracks was interpreted as the answer of the ancestors or the gods. These inscriptions were later annotated with the outcome, creating the earliest body of written Chinese records. The questions carved into oracle bones reveal a vivid picture of Shang society. Kings asked whether it would rain, whether hunting would be successful, or whether an enemy should be attacked. They inquired about sacrifices should sheep or cattle be offered. Would the ancestors approve? There were also personal concerns: the health of a royal consort, the birth of a child, the outcome of illness. These bones preserved by thousands show that the Shang king was not only a political leader but also the chief mediator between the human and spiritual worlds. From these inscriptions, the earliest form of Chinese writing can be traced. The characters carved into bone are recognizable ancestors of modern Chinese script. Over 3,000 distinct characters have been identified, many still familiar today in modified form. Writing gave permanence to ritual, and it bound memory into material form. It also reinforced hierarchy, for literacy was the tool of kings and divers, not the common people. Daily life under the Shang reflected both continuity with Neolithic traditions and new levels of complexity. Millet farming remained central in the north, supplemented with wheat, barley, and rice imported from southern regions. Pigs, cattle, and sheep were raised, and hunting provided meat from deer and wild boar. Chariots introduced from steppe cultures became symbols of status and instruments of warfare. Workshops produced jade ornaments, bone tools, and bronze weapons indicating specialization of labor. Society was sharply divided. Kings and nobles lived with luxury and power while commoners worked the fields and provided tribute. At the lowest level were slaves, many captured in war who labored in construction or were sacrificed in rituals. The military strength of the Shang was formidable. Armies were equipped with bronze weapons, daggers, spearheads, and battle axes that gave them an advantage over neighboring peoples still using stone. Chariots drawn by horses allowed mobility and shock power. The king personally led campaigns as recorded on oracle bones against rival states or nomadic groups along the borders. War brought not only territory but captives who became slaves or sacrificial victims. The Shang state was thus sustained by a cycle of tribute, warfare, and ritual that reinforced the authority of the king. The royal family itself was at the center of Shang society. The king ruled with absolute authority supported by a network of nobles and relatives who governed outlying regions. Royal consorts also appear prominently in the record. One remarkable example is Lady Fu Hao, whose tomb at Anyang is among the most significant archaeological discoveries in China. Fu Hao was not only a queen consort but also a military general and high priestess. Her tomb contained hundreds of bronzes, weapons, and the remains of sacrificial victims, showing her extraordinary status. Oracle bones record her participation in campaigns and rituals, offering rare insight into the prominent role of women at the highest levels of Shang society. The Shang worldview was deeply religious. Heaven, earth, and the realm of ancestors were inseparably connected. Rituals were not symbolic acts but essential negotiations with the spirit world. To neglect sacrifice or divination was to risk disaster, floods, famine, or military defeat. This belief system tied political legitimacy to spiritual communication, giving the king authority as the chief diver. It also reinforced social order, for all classes depended on the king's role as intermediary between human and divine. Despite its power, the Shang dynasty was not eternal. By the 11th century BCE, pressures from within and without began to erode its strength. Neighboring peoples, once defeated, grew stronger. The cost of constant warfare and massive rituals drained resources. The nobility spread across semi-independent fiefdoms grew ambitious. The king's authority weakened as challenges mounted. It was in this environment that the Zhou, a Western people, rose to power and eventually overthrew the Shang. The fall of the Shang did not erase its legacy. The Zhou adopted and transformed many Shang traditions, bronze rituals, ancestor worship, and the written script. They justified their conquest by claiming the mandate of heaven, a concept that would dominate Chinese political thought for over 2 millennia. In this way, the Shang dynasty became not just a historical chapter, but the foundation upon which all later Chinese dynasties stood. At the close of the Shang age, we see a civilization already complex, already deeply symbolic, and already defining itself through both continuity and change. The bones and bronzes of the Shang remain silent in the earth. Yet through them, the voices of ancient kings, divers, and warriors still whisper. They remind us that China's history is not only myth, but material carved into bone and cast into bronze. The next stage of the story belongs to the Zhou, who would take the rituals and symbols of the Shang and give them new meaning, creating a political philosophy that would define China's dynastic cycle for centuries to come. Zhou's Mandate of Heaven, the fall of the Shang around 146 BCE, CE did not mark an end, but rather a transformation. From the west, a new power rose, the Zhou Dynasty, bringing with it both continuity and innovation. The Zhou inherited the rituals and symbols of the Shang, but they added something profoundly new, a political philosophy that would shape Chinese thought for over 2,000 years. This was the idea of the mandate of heaven, a vision of rulership that tied political legitimacy to cosmic order. The Zhou homeland lay along the Wei River Valley in what is now Shanxi Province. Unlike the Shang heartland in the Central Plains, this region was more rugged with fertile basins framed by mountains. The Zhou were once semi-nomadic people who paid tribute to the Shang, but over time they grew in strength and organization. By the late 11th century BCE, they had become a formidable force. Under the leadership of King Wu, the Zhou launched a campaign against the Shang, culminating in the Battle of Mui around 146 BCE. According to tradition, King Wu led an army of about 50,000 against the Shang Kingo. Not to be confused with the Zhou Dynasty, whose tyranny and excess had alienated many. Defections swelled the Zhou ranks and the Shang fell. The Zhou leaders faced a challenge: how to justify their conquest. They could not simply dismiss the Shang, for the Shang rituals, bronzes, and ancestor worship remained central to Chinese culture. Instead, they reframed the story. They argued that the Shang kings had once held divine favor, but through corruption and misrule, they had lost it. Heaven they, feudal lords, plunging China into centuries of division and turmoil. The story would then pass into an age of philosophers, reformers, and warlords, a time when the seeds of Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism were planted amid chaos. For now, we pause at the height of the Zhou's authority. When kings spoke as sons of heaven, bronzes gleamed in ancestral halls, and the idea of cosmic mandate gave meaning to both rule and rebellion. The stage is set for the next chapter, the Age of Fragmentation, when feudal lords began to outshine their king, and great thinkers sought answers to a world falling out of harmony. Feudal lords and ritual wars. The Western Zhou had begun with strength, stability, and a sense of divine sanction. But the very system that allowed them to rule a vast territory contained the seeds of division. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, the Zhou dynasty was shifting into a new and turbulent phase. Kings still presided as sons of heaven, but their power grew more symbolic. While feudal lords, the dukes, marquises, counts, and barons who controlled their own fiefs expanded their influence. This period, stretching from the 9th to the 8th centuries BCE, reveals a China balancing between unity and fragmentation, ritual and rivalry, tradition and transformation. The feudal system of the Zhou was both practical and dangerous. When King Wu and his successors conquered the Shang and extended their authority, they rewarded allies and relatives with land. These lords swore loyalty, offered tribute, and supplied soldiers to the king when called upon. In return, they ruled their domains almost autonomously. The Zhou realms stretched far, covering not only the Central Plains, but reaching into regions inhabited by non-Ho peoples. Feudalism spread Zhou culture, but it also created a patchwork of semi-independent states. In the early Western Zhou, the balance held. Kings like King Cheng and King Kong reinforced central authority, presiding over grand rituals that affirmed their status as sons of heaven. Ritual was the glue of Zhou society. The performance of ceremonies, sacrifices, and music tied the lords to the royal house, reminding them of their place in a cosmic hierarchy, to honor ancestors, to pour libations of wine, to strike bronze bells and drums. These were not simply cultural expressions, but acts of political loyalty. The Zhou court codified these practices in what became known as Li or ritual propriety. Li governed not only sacrifices to heaven and ancestors but also etiquette in war, diplomacy, and daily conduct. It was the code that gave structure to the relationships between king and vassals, lords and ministers, parents and children. Though later Confucianism would refine and reinterpret its foundations were laid in the Zhou world where ritual was both religion and law. Yet the system strained under its own weight. As generations passed, feudal lords grew entrenched in their territories, building their own cities, commanding their own armies, and forging their own alliances. The Zhou king, while still ritually supreme, often lacked the power to enforce his will beyond the capital. Tribute could be withheld, military support delayed, and rituals performed independently. The king's role became increasingly ceremonial as lords maneuvered for real power. This shift is visible in the archaeological record. Inscriptions on Zhou bronzes from the later Western Zhou period increasingly commemorate the deeds of local lords rather than kings. Lords celebrated their victories, alliances, and ancestral dedications with inscriptions that highlighted their autonomy. The king's name appears less frequently, reflecting the declining reach of royal authority. The military culture of this era also reveals both order and conflict. Warfare was guided by ritual as much as by strategy. Battles were often preceded by divination, sacrifices, and elaborate ceremonies. Rules governed the conduct of war. Noble opponents were to be treated with respect and certain rituals observed even in combat. Chariots dominated the battlefield, each carrying a noble warrior and his retinue. Armies were relatively small compared to later eras and campaigns often aimed less at conquest than at the assertion of prestige or the enforcement of ritual obligations. Despite the formalism, violence was real. Lords raided one another, seized territory, and captured enemies. Smaller states were swallowed by larger ones, and alliances shifted constantly. The Zhou king attempted to arbitrate disputes, but his authority often rested more on persuasion and ritual recognition than on force. This delicate balance sustained the Western Zhou for centuries, but it could not last indefinitely. The cracks began to show in the 8th century BCE. External pressures mounted as non-Jew peoples, often labeled as barbarians in the chronicles, pressed against the borders. These groups, including R and D tribes to the north and west, tested the Zhou defenses. Internally, ambitious lords began to defy the king more openly. Tribute and military support waned. The Zhou capital itself became vulnerable. The breaking point came in 771 BCE, when the Zhou court was attacked by a coalition of rebellious lords and outside groups. The capital at Haojing was sacked and King Yu was killed. His death marked the end of the Western Zhou and the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period. The Zhou royal line survived, but only barely, retreating eastward to Luoyang. There, stripped of much of its power, the king remained a figurehead while real authority shifted to the feudal states. This collapse ushered in centuries of turmoil that historians later divided into two great ages. The spring and autumn periods 774–76 BCE and the Warring States period 475–221 BCE. In these eras, ritual wars gave way to larger, more brutal conflicts, and the competition of states fostered intellectual and cultural revolutions. But even as the system fractured, the idea of the mandate of heaven endured. The Zhou kings, though weak, still symbolized cosmic legitimacy. Lords might fight for dominance, but they did so under the shadow of the Zhou name and the rituals that bound their world. Thus, The age of feudal lords and ritual wars stands as a bridge between the unified vision of the early Zhou and the chaos of the later centuries. It was a time when bronze bells rang in ancestral halls, when chariots thundered across battlefields, when kings presided in name, but lords held real power. It was a world still defined by ritual, yet increasingly driven by ambition. The next chapter will carry us into the spring and autumn period, when fragmentation deepened and new voices, Confucius, Laozi, and many others rose to seek order in a world slipping into disarray. Spring and autumn upheaval. The fall of the Western Zhou in 771 BC set China upon a new course. The Zhou kings still existed, enthroned in Luoyang, but their power was a shadow of what it had once been. They presided as ritual figureheads, keepers of heaven's mandate in name only, while the true power lay in the hands of the feudal lords who controlled their own states. This was the beginning of the Eastern Zhou Dynasty, and its first great phase is known as the Spring and Autumn period, stretching from 770 to 476 BCE. The name comes from the Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle from the state of Lu that recorded events year-by-year. But the term also carries a deeper resonance, the sense of constant change, of seasons turning, of a world in flux. In these centuries, more than 100 states jostled for survival and influence. Alliances formed and dissolved, and the Zhou royal house dwindled into little more than ceremonial presence. Yet, out of this turmoil came some of the most enduring ideas in Chinese thought. At the start of the Spring and Autumn period, the Zhou realm was still dotted with numerous feudal states, large and small. Over time, weaker states were absorbed and stronger ones asserted dominance. Chronicles tell of more than 1,000 wars in this period. Some small raids, others decisive battles that shifted the balance of power. Armies marched with chariots and bronze weapons. But warfare was still governed, at least in principle, by ritual codes inherited from the Western Zhou. Nobles treated each other as peers, exchanging hostages, negotiating truces, and observing ceremonial rules, even in conflict. Yet behind the veneer of ritual, power was consolidating. Certain states began to rise as hegemon lords, strong rulers who, while not kings, exercised authority over coalitions of states. The first of these was the Duke of Qi in the 7th century BCE, who called together alliances to defend the Zhou king and repel external enemies. Later, rulers of Jin, Chu, Qin, and Wu would hold similar positions. These hegemons claimed to act in the name of the Zhou king, preserving the mandate of heaven in form. If not in fact, the political landscape was dynamic. The state of Jin dominated the north, while Chu, a southern state once considered semi-barbarian, expanded aggressively into the central plains. Qi, located along the eastern coast, grew wealthy from trade and salt production. Wu and Yue, far to the southeast, emerged as rivals in the later spring and autumn years. Qin in the far west was still relatively minor but already laying the foundations of future power. This shifting balance of states created a world of constant tension and opportunity. Social changes accompanied political upheaval. Bronze weapons and chariots still symbolized elite power. But iron tools began to spread in the later centuries, boosting agricultural productivity. Population growth fueled urbanization. States built larger cities with walls, markets, and administrative centers. The aristocratic order of the early Zhou was strained as new elites, wealthy landowners, merchants, and professional soldiers rose in influence. Ritual still mattered, but merit and military strength increasingly decided fate. It was in this crucible that China's great philosophical traditions emerged. The uncertainty of the age with Constant wars and weakening rituals inspired thinkers to seek answers to profound questions. What holds society together? What makes a ruler legitimate? How should one live a good life in a world of chaos? The most famous of these voices was Confucius Laozi. Born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, a minor noble by birth, Confucius lived in a time of political disorder and moral decline. He longed for a return to the harmony of earlier Zhou ideals, but sought to adapt them to a fractured world. His teachings emphasized Ren, benevolence, humanist, Li, ritual propriety, and the importance of education and moral cultivation. For Confucius, rulers should lead by virtue, setting an example that would inspire order. Families should be structured by filial piety with respect flowing from children to parents, subjects to rulers, and ultimately all humanity aligned with heaven's order. Though Confucius never achieved high office, his disciples preserved his teachings in the annals, ensuring his ideas would echo for centuries. At the time, he was one of many voices in what later scholars called the 100 Schools of Thought, a flourishing of philosophy unique in world history. Alongside Confucius stood Laozi, traditionally considered the founder of Taoism, Doya. While Confucius emphasized ritual and moral duty, Laozi spoke of the Tao, the way, a natural order that flowed through all things. He taught that harmony was not achieved by rigid rules, but by aligning with the rhythms of nature, practicing humility, and embracing simplicity. The Tao Te Ching attributed to him became one of the most influential texts in Chinese philosophy, urging rulers to govern with minimal interference and individuals to cultivate balance within themselves. Other thinkers also arose. Mozi preached universal love and meritocracy, criticizing Confucian elitism and ritual waste. The early seeds of legalism, a harsher philosophy that emphasized law and order over virtue, were also sown in this age. These diverse ideas reflected the deep hunger for solutions to the problems of a fragmented world. Despite turmoil, the spring and autumn period was not only an age of war and philosophy. It was also a time of cultural growth. Poetry flourished, preserved in the Book of Songs, Shi Jin, which contained both court hymns and folk ballads. These verses spoke of farming, love, war, and ritual, providing a vivid picture of life across social classes. Music and dance remained central to ritual, blending artistry with politics. By the late 6th and 5th centuries BCE, the rituals of the old order were fading. Warfare grew more brutal, iron weapons became widespread, and the chivalry of noble jewels gave way to large armies of common soldiers. The Zhou king's authority was almost entirely symbolic, invoked in name, but ignored in fact. The states maneuvered for survival. Alliances shifted constantly, and the stage was set for an even more violent and decisive era, the Warring States period. The spring and autumn period remains one of the most formative ages in Chinese history. It was a time when political unity disintegrated, but intellectual creativity flourished. The questions asked by Confucius, Laozi, and their contemporaries would echo down through every dynasty. Even as war raged and states fell, the search for harmony, order, and meaning continued, proof that in China, turmoil could be a seedbed for profound reflection. At the close of this chapter, we stand on the threshold of deeper chaos. The noble wars of the spring and autumn would soon give way to the ruthless strategies of the warring states. 7 great powers would dominate the land, and out of their clash would rise the first true empire under the Qin, warring states frenzy. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, the world of ritualized warfare and aristocratic jewels had come to an end. The chariot clashes of noble houses bound by courtesy and guided by ancestral codes were swept aside by a harsher reality. This was the beginning of the Warring States period 475–221 BC, an age when China fractured into a handful of powerful kingdoms, each seeking to devour the others. It was an age of ambition, ruthlessness, and innovation. Yet, it was also an age of extraordinary creativity, when ideas sharpened like blades in the furnace of conflict and when strategies that would define empire first took shape. At the start of this period, more than 100 feudal states dotted the Zhou realm through centuries of consolidation, conquest, and alliance. Only 7 great powers emerged to dominate the land. Qi in the east, Chu in the south, Yan in the north, Han, Shao and Wei in the central plains, and Qin in the far west. These are remembered as the 7 Warring States, though smaller states still lingered at their margins. Each of these kingdoms was fiercely independent, with its own capital, armies, and bureaucracy. The Zhao king remained in Luoyang, but his authority was purely symbolic, invoked as a formality, while the real power lay entirely with the rulers of these states. No longer content with ritual alliances, these rulers sought absolute dominance. The ultimate prize was nothing less than the unification of all under heaven. Warfare in this era was unlike anything before. Iron weapons became standard, replacing bronze. Crossbows appeared, powerful enough to pierce armor at a distance, giving infantry unprecedented strength against mounted chariots. Armies swelled into the hundreds of thousands, composed not only of aristocrats, but of common farmers conscripted into service. Walls of states grew massive, rivaling one another in height and breadth. Fortifications spread across the land, an ominous sign of perpetual war. This transformation required new forms of governance. The aristocratic feudalism of the early Zhao gave way to centralized bureaucracies. States created administrative districts, appointed officials on merit, and collected taxes directly from peasants. The growing class of bureaucrats, men of learning and talent rather than noble birth, helped manage records, organize armies, and oversee irrigation. Society was shifting from kinship and ritual toward efficiency and control. Among the philosophies of the age, legalism rose to prominence. Legalist thinkers such as Shang in the state of Qin argued that human beings were inherently selfish and that only strict laws, harsh punishments, and strong central authority could maintain order. Unlike Confucian ideals of virtue or Taoist appeals to natural harmony, legalism placed its faith in institutions and discipline. It was a philosophy well suited to the brutal realities of the Warring States. The competition also produced one of the world's most famous texts on strategy, The Art of War, attributed to Xuanzi Sundesu. Written during the 5th century BCE, this treatise distilled the lessons of endless battles into principles of cunning, flexibility, and psychological insight. Xuanzi taught that the greatest victory was to win without fighting, that deception and speed outweighed brute force, and that a general's wisdom was more decisive than numbers. These ideas resonated in the Warring States, where survival often depended on wit as much as strength. The states themselves took on distinct characters. Chu, vast and wealthy in the south, commanded fertile lands and a rich cultural tradition. Its rulers were often considered flamboyant, and Chu poetry left a unique mark on Chinese literature. Qi in the east grew wealthy from trade and salt production, and its rulers sponsored of scholars where debates flourished. Yan in the far north was more isolated, but its proximity to steppe peoples made it a frontier of cultural exchange. In the central plains, the states of Han, Shao, and Wei, together, known as the Three Jin, after their origin in the partition of Jin, vied for dominance with one another. Each was relatively small compared to Chu or Qin, but they occupied strategic territory. And then there was Qin, once considered a backward Western state through reforms led by Shang in the 4th century BCE. Qin transformed into a disciplined, militarized powerhouse. Its laws were strict, its bureaucracy efficient, and its armies relentless. In time, Qin would prove to be the state most prepared to unify China. The cultural flourishing of this age was no less remarkable than its wars. The 100 schools of thought, already alive in the spring and autumn period, reached their height. Confucians continue to argue for moral governance, Taoists for harmony with the Tao, Mahists for universal love, and legalists for strict law. Diplomats and scholars wandered from state to state, offering their wisdom to rulers in search of advantage. These intellectuals became known as the wandering persuaders or vertical and horizontal alliance strategists, masters of rhetoric who negotiated alliances and devised policies. Life for common people, however, was harsh. Farmers bore the burden of supporting armies and paying taxes. Fields of millet, wheat, and rice provided the grain that fed both soldiers and civilians. But conscription often left villages depleted of men. Peasants endured labor on fortifications and canals, their lives bound to the demands of their rulers. Yet agriculture advanced with iron plows and irrigation, supporting larger populations than ever before. Despite the suffering, the warring states fostered innovation. Standardized measures of weight and length appeared within states to facilitate trade and taxation. Roads and canals expanded, allowing armies to move swiftly and goods to circulate more freely. Chariots gave way to cavalry as horses bred for riding became more common. War drove technology, and technology reshaped society as decades turned into centuries. The wars intensified. States swallowed smaller neighbors, and shifting alliances constantly redrew the map. By the 3rd century BCE, the struggle narrowed to a few great rivals. Qin in the west, Zhou in the north, Chu in the south, and Qi in the east. The others fought desperately to survive, but the logic of consolidation was inexorable. Through all this, the Zhou king remained in Luoyang, a relic of a bygone age. Rituals still named him as the Son of Heaven, but no one obeyed his commands. His role had shrunk to a symbol invoked when useful, ignored when not. The true contest for the mandate of heaven played out on the battlefields of the warring states. This was a world of frenzy, ambition, and transformation. It was brutal in its wars, but brilliant in its ideas. It was here that the foundations of empire were laid. Centralized states, codified laws, standing armies, and philosophical visions of order. Out of the blood and fire of these centuries, a new kind of China was emerging, one that would soon be unified under the iron hand of Qin. Qin unification. By the late 3rd century BCE, the long and brutal contest of the warring states was reaching its inevitable conclusion. For over 2 centuries, 7 great powers had clashed across the Central Plains, each claiming heaven's favor, each seeking to be the sole master under heaven. States rose, alliances crumbled, and thousands of battles scarred the land. But amid the chaos, one state grew stronger than all the rest. Qin, once a remote western kingdom, dismissed as a rough frontier power, now transformed into the most disciplined and ruthless machine had ever seen. The rise of Qin owed much to geography. Located in the Wei River Valley, shielded by mountains to the south and west, Qin possessed natural defenses. Its fertile basins supported rich agriculture, while iron and timber from surrounding highlands supplied weapons and construction. Equally important, Qin lay on the western frontier, where it had long contended with nomadic tribes. This constant struggle hardened its rulers and people, forging a culture of discipline and military readiness. But geography alone could not explain Qin's ascent. In the 4th century BCE, the reformer Shang transformed the state under his legalist policies. Qin abolished the old feudal nobility, dividing land into administrative counties governed directly by officials loyal to the king. Farmers were taxed directly, registered in households, and rewarded or punished according to strict laws. Military merit, not birth, became the path to honor. Soldiers were promoted for kills on the battlefield, not for lineage. Agriculture and war were exalted as the twin pillars of the state, while luxury and idleness were condemned. The harshness of Shang's laws was legendary. Collective responsibility meant that households were punished if one member broke the law. Rewards were generous for military service, but penalties for disobedience were severe. Yet, this discipline created results. Qin grew richer, more organized, and more powerful than its rivals. Its bureaucracy functioned with precision, its armies drilled relentlessly, and its rulers wielded power with uncompromising authority. By the mid-3 RD century BCE, Qin was poised for conquest. The man who would carry this ambition to its climax was King Yung, who ascended the throne in 246 BCE. As a boy and soon proved himself a formidable ruler. With the guidance of capable ministers such as Li and generals like Wang Jian, he launched campaigns that one by one destroyed the other warring states. The process was relentless. In 230 BCE, Qin struck at Han, the weakest of the seven, and swiftly annexed it. 2 years later, in 228 BCE, Zhou fell after a long struggle. Its once proud armies crushed. In 225 BCE, Qin besieged the capital of Wei, flooding it by diverting a river, forcing surrender. In 223 BCE, the great southern state of Chu, long considered Qin's fiercest rival, was finally defeated in a series of bloody battles. In 222 BCE, Yen was conquered, and in 221 BCE Qi, the last remaining state, surrendered without a fight. For the first time in history, the Chinese world was unified under a single ruler. King Yung declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. His new title marked a break with the past. He was not merely a king among others, but the supreme sovereign of all under heaven. The old feudal order was abolished. In its place, Qin established a centralized empire. Its authority extending from the Yellow River to the Yangtze, from the eastern coast to the steppes of the west. The unification of Qin was not only military but administrative. Qin Shi Huang standardized weights and measures, ensuring uniform trade and taxation. He imposed a common currency, circular bronze coins with square holes that circulated across the empire. He unified the written script, simplifying characters into a standard form used by scribes and officials. These reforms bound the empire together, turning conquered lands into a coherent whole. The emperor also embarked on massive infrastructure projects. Roads radiated from the capital of Shanyang, linking distant provinces with straight stone-paved highways. Canals were dug to move grain and armies. These arteries of empire allowed Qin's power to flow rapidly across its vast territory. Farmers were resettled, land redistributed, and frontiers secured with fortifications. Perhaps most famously, Qin Shi Huang began the construction of defensive walls along the northern frontier. These fortifications, built by linking and extending earlier state walls, formed the foundation of what would later become the Great Wall of China. Though far from the continuous stone barrier seen today, these early walls served as a bulwark against nomadic raids, symbolizing both Qin's might and its anxiety about threats beyond its borders. The emperor was a man of immense ambition and paranoia. He sought to eliminate threats not only from enemies but from ideas. In 213 BCE, he ordered the infamous burning of books and burying of scholars. Texts not aligned with legalist doctrine, particularly those of history, poetry, and philosophy, were confiscated and destroyed. Scholars who resisted were executed or exiled. The purpose was clear: to erase dissent and ensure that the empire recognized no authority but the emperor. While later dynasties would restore much of what was lost, this act cast a shadow over Qin's legacy. Remembered as a symbol of tyranny, Qin Shi Huang was also obsessed with immortality. He sent expeditions in search of elixir and magical islands, hoping to escape death. Alchemists promised him longevity, and vast sums were spent on futile quests. Yet, even as he sought eternity, he left behind one of the most enduring monuments of all time, the Terracotta Army. Buried near his mausoleum at Lian, this army of thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each with unique features, was crafted to guard him in the afterlife. Horses, chariots, and weapons accompanied them. A silent host prepared to serve their emperor forever. Life under Qin rule was harsh. The empire demanded taxes, labor, and obedience. Farmers were conscripted to build walls, roads, and palaces, often at immense human cost. Punishments for disobedience were severe, and surveillance was constant. Yet, the empire also brought stability after centuries of war. Trade flourished along new roads. Markets expanded, and the once fragmented states now shared common laws and measures. For ordinary people, the Qin dynasty was both a burden and a relief, oppressive in its demands, but also orderly in its governance. Despite its strength, Qin's rule was brittle. The sheer harshness of its laws and the exhaustion of constant labor bred resentment. When Qin Shi Huang died suddenly in 210 BCE during a tour of his empire, the dynasty unraveled with shocking speed. His successors proved weak. Court intrigues erupted and rebellions spread. Within a few years, Qin collapsed, leaving behind both a model of empire and a warning of tyranny. Yet, its achievement was undeniable. Qin had unified China not just in name but in infrastructure, administration, and imagination. The title of emperor, the idea of centralized rule, the vision of one state under heaven. These would endure long after the Qin dynasty itself had fallen out of the chaos of the warring states. Qin had forged a single empire, blazing a path that all future dynasties would follow. As the Qin flame burned out almost as quickly as it had ignited, the land once again faced turmoil. But from the ashes would rise a dynasty even greater, one that would consolidate Qin's achievements and temper them with longevity. The Han Dynasty, China's first golden age, Han Golden Age. When the Qin dynasty collapsed in 206 BCE, it left behind ruins of grandeur and bitterness. The empire that Qin Shi Huang had forged through iron discipline and relentless conquest had disintegrated within a generation of his death. The people had known unification, but they had also tasted the sharpness of legalist severity and the weight of endless conscription. Out of this wreckage, a new dynasty emerged, the Han. And with it, China entered what would become one of the most celebrated golden ages in its long history. The story of the Han begins with Liu Bang, a man of humble origins. Born into a peasant family, he rose to prominence as a rebel leader during the civil wars that followed Qin's collapse. Unlike the aristocratic generals who commanded other factions, Liu Bang had little noble lineage. His strength lay in pragmatism, charisma, and the loyalty of his followers. After years of struggle, he triumphed over his rivals, most famously the warlord Shang Yu. And in 202 BCE, Liu Bang declared himself emperor, founding the Han Dynasty. As Emperor Gao, Luang struck a balance that Qin had failed to achieve. He retained the centralized administrative system created by Baikan County's officials' taxation but tempered it with leniency. Harsh punishments were softened, labor demands reduced, and Confucian ideals gradually blended with legalist structures. Where Qin had ruled through fear, the Han sought to govern through both law and moral order. This combination created resilience and stability. The Han Dynasty is traditionally divided into two great eras. The Western Han 202 BC9 CE with its capital at Chang'an and the Eastern Han 220 CE with its capital later at Luoyang. Between them came a brief interregnum when the usurper Wang Mang seized the throne and attempted radical reforms only to be overthrown. But taken together, the Han Dynasty lasted more than 4 centuries, longer than almost any other in Chinese history. Under the Han, the empire expanded dramatically. Early emperors consolidated the heartland, while later rulers extended China's borders. The most famous of these was Emperor Wu of Han. Han Wui 1418 BCE. His reign marked the height of Han power. Wu launched campaigns that pushed the empire's frontiers deep into Central Asia, securing trade routes that would become known as the Silk Road. Through these routes, silk, jade, and lacer traveled westward, while horses, glass, and precious metals flowed eastward. China was connected to distant worlds, Persia, India, even the fringes of the Mediterranean. The Silk Road was not only about goods. Ideas, technologies, and religions moved along its paths. Buddhism, still in its infancy in India, began to filter into China. During the later Han, diplomatic missions carried news of far-off kingdoms. For the first time, China was woven into a network of exchange that spanned continents, a development that would shape its history for centuries. Domestically, the Han Dynasty perfected the Confucian state. While Qin had exalted legalism, the Han embraced Confucianism as its official ideology. Schools were established to train officials in the classics, emphasizing filial piety, ritual, and moral virtue. By the 2nd century BCE, the imperial examination system was taking form, selecting bureaucrats not by birth, but by learning. This created a meritocratic ideal, though still largely limited to elites that endured throughout imperial history. Confucianism was not the only current of thought. Taoist practices flourished, blending philosophy with religion, medicine, and ritual. Legalist principles still underpinned law and administration. The fusion of these traditions created a unique balance. Moral order, guiding governance, law providing structure, and ritual sustaining legitimacy. The Han era was also a time of remarkable innovation. Paper was invented in the 2nd century BCE, revolutionizing the recording of knowledge. Advances in metallurgy produced steel and iron tools that boosted agriculture and warfare. Seismographs were devised to detect earthquakes. Astronomical observations, refined calendars. Medicine advanced through herbal studies and acupuncture. The Han combined practicality with curiosity, making their age one of both stability and discovery. Daily life under the Han varied greatly. Farmers who made up the majority worked fields of millet, rice, and wheat. Their surplus-fed cities that grew into bustling centers of trade and administration. Yangon, the capital, became one of the world's largest cities. Its markets filled with merchants, artisans, and officials. Nobles and wealthy families lived in walled compounds with servants and luxuries, while peasants lived modestly, often struggling with taxes and corv labor. Yet even the humblest villages participated in festivals, ancestor worship, and seasonal rituals that tied them to the broader rhythms of the empire. Society was hierarchical, but mobility was possible. A farmer's son, if talented and educated, could become an official through study. Merchants, though often looked down upon in Confucian hierarchy, amassed wealth through trade along new routes. Soldiers who distinguished themselves could rise in rank. Women's roles remained centered on family and domestic life, though some like the historian Banjeo achieved prominence through scholarship. Religion and ritual remained central. The Han court performed sacrifices to heaven and earth while ordinary families honored ancestors with offerings. Taoist cults grew, promising longevity and harmony. By the later Han, Buddhist monks from India began to appear, bringing new ideas of salvation and rebirth. The religious landscape was diverse, reflecting both tradition and innovation. The Han Dynasty also left behind an extraordinary historical record. The historian Simeon, serving in the 1st century BCE, compiled the records of the grand historian Shi, a monumental work tracing China's past from mythic times to his present. Despite personal suffering castrated after offending Emperor Wu, Sima Qian persisted in completing his history, which became the model for all later dynastic chronicles. His work ensured that the memory of Xia, Shang, Zhou, and Qin lived on, and that the Han itself would be remembered as part of a continuous story. Yet even this golden age was not free from problems. Factional struggles at court, burdensome taxes on peasants, and the power of noble families all strained the system. Corruption crept into bureaucracy, and powerful eunuchs gained influence over young emperors. By the end of the Eastern Han, rebellion flared. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE, led by Taoist inspired peasant leaders, shook the empire. Though suppressed, it revealed deep social unrest. By 220 CE, the Han Dynasty had fallen, splintering into rival kingdoms. This golden age ended, but its legacy endured. Later dynasties would look back to the Han as a model of imperial grandeur, a standard to be emulated. The very name Han became synonymous with Chinese identity. To this day, the majority ethnic group in China call themselves the Han people. The Han Dynasty was more than an age of emperors and conquests. It was the time when Chinese civilization took on its enduring form. Centralized government, Confucian ideology, technological progress, and cultural flourishing. It was an age when China first reached beyond its borders, linking itself to the wider world. And though it eventually fractured, the Han Golden Age remained a touchstone, a memory of stability and brilliance that would guide China through centuries of change. As the Han collapsed, China entered a long period of division, the Age of the Three Kingdoms. When rival warlords contended for supremacy, it was an age of strife, but also of legend, when stories of heroes and battles would become immortal in Chinese culture. Han's collapse and Three Kingdoms. The grandeur of the Han had lasted for centuries, but even golden ages arose under the weight of their own contradictions. By the late 2nd century CE, the Eastern Han Dynasty was exhausted. Its bureaucracy was riddled with corruption, its court dominated by eunuchs and factions, and its farmers burdened by taxes and labor service. Natural disasters struck with uncanny frequency: floods, droughts, locusts, interpreted by many as heaven's displeasure. Beneath the surface of imperial order, discontent was brewing. The most dramatic eruption came in 184 CE when the Yellow Turban Rebellion swept across the empire. Led by Django and his brothers, who preached a millenarian Taoist-inspired faith, hundreds of thousands of peasants rose up wearing yellow headscarves as their banner. They proclaimed that the blue heavens are dead, the yellow heavens shall rise, calling for a new age of justice. For a moment, it seemed as if the Han might be swept away entirely. Though the rebellion was brutally suppressed by imperial generals, the damage was lasting. The uprising revealed the fragility of the Han order and drained resources that the state could not spare. Military commanders who crushed the Yellow Turbans gained power and independence, carving out spheres of influence that eclipsed the authority of the emperor. The dynasty staggered on, but its days were numbered. By the early 3rd century CE, the empire fractured into rival warlord regimes. The emperor remained in Luoyang and later Chang'an, but he was little more than a puppet passed between competing factions. Among the most powerful figures were Tao in the north, Sun Quan in the southeast, and Louis in the west. Their rivalries, alliances, and betrayals set the stage for one of the most famous eras in Chinese history. The Three Kingdoms 22200 and 80 CE. Tao, a brilliant but ruthless strategist, rose from modest origins to dominate northern China. Though often vilified in later literature as a cunning villain, he was an able administrator and military leader. He consolidated the north, strengthened agriculture, and built disciplined armies. His state of Wei, headquartered at Luoyang and later Xuchang, was the most powerful of the three. In the south, Sunwan inherited leadership from his elder brother Sun and established the Kingdom of Wu based in the lower Yangtze Valley. Wu was rich in resources with fertile lands and access to maritime trade. Its naval strength allowed it to control the rivers and defend against northern invasions. To the west, Liu Bai, claiming descent from the Han royal family, presented himself as the true heir of legitimacy. With the help of his brilliant advisor, Zhugliang Lui carved out the Kingdom of Shu based in Sichuan. Though smaller and less powerful than Wei or Wu, Shu was protected by mountains and inspired loyalty through its claim to Han heritage. The Three Kingdoms era was marked by constant warfare, shifting alliances, and legendary battles. The most famous of these was the Battle of Red Cliffs, 208 CE, where a coalition of Sun, Quan, and Lui defeated Tao's massive northern fleet on the Yangtze River. Using fire ships and clever strategy, the smaller southern forces turned the tide, preventing Tao from unifying China under his rule. Red Cliffs became immortalized as one of the great turning points of Chinese history. Despite moments of brilliance, the Three Kingdoms were locked in stalemate. Wei held the north, Wu the southeast, Shu the west. Diplomats negotiated, spies infiltrated, and armies marched ceaselessly. But no state could fully conquer the others. The era became legendary not only for its battles, but also for its characters. Generals, advisors, and rulers whose loyalty, cunning, or bravery captured the imagination of later generations. This was the world later immortalized in the epic novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written in the 14th century, but drawing on the histories of the 3rd century. Figures like Guan Yu, revered for his loyalty and martial skill, and Zhugliang, celebrated for his wisdom and foresight, became cultural icons. Their stories, though embellished by legend, reflect the values of loyalty, strategy, and resilience that the age inspired. Life for ordinary people during this era was difficult. Endless warfare meant heavy conscription and taxation. Fields were abandoned, villages destroyed, and populations displaced. Yet local cultures persisted, and even amid chaos, trade continued along rivers and roads. The resilience of Chinese society is evident. Even when political order collapsed, the rhythms of agriculture, family, and ritual endured. By 263 CE, Wei conquered Shu, ending Lu's dream of restoring the Han. Yet only a few years later, in 265 CE, the Wei dynasty itself was usurped by the powerful Sima family, who established the Qin Dynasty. Finally, in 280 CE, the Jin conquered Wu, reuniting China after nearly a century of division. The Three Kingdoms era was over, but its legacy endured in memory, literature, and culture. For later generations, the Three Kingdoms represented both tragedy and inspiration. It was a time of disunity and suffering, but also of heroism and ingenuity. Its stories became moral lessons, its figures cultural archetypes. To this day, the tales of loyalty, betrayal, and strategy from this age remain deeply woven into Chinese identity. Thus, from the collapse of the Han through the chaos of rebellion and warlordism, China entered an age of division that was as fertile for legend as it was destructive in reality. And though the Qin dynasty briefly reunited the land, the cycle of unity and fragmentation was far from over. Ahead lay centuries of upheaval, when nomadic invasions, shifting dynasties, and cultural transformations would continue to shape the vast tapestry of China's history. Qin and northern invasions, the reunification of China under the Western Qin Dynasty, 265–316 CE, brought for a brief moment the promise of stability after nearly a century of civil war. Founded by the Sima family, who seized power from the state of Wei and then conquered Wu in 280 CE, the Qin dynasty seemed to restore the ancient dream of a single empire under heaven. Yet this unity was fragile. Within a generation, it would splinter under the weight of internal conflict and foreign invasions, plunging China into centuries of division and turmoil. The Sima family's rise began in Wei. Sima Yi, a brilliant general and strategist, had long served the Tao family, but in time he outmaneuvered his masters. His descendants consolidated power until Sima Yan, grandson of Sima, forced the last Wei emperor to abdicate in 265 CE, declaring himself Emperor Wu of Jin. With formidable armies and political cunning, he completed the conquest of Wu in 280 CE, bringing all three kingdoms under Jin control. For the first time since the collapse of the Han, China was whole. On the surface, the Western Jin enjoyed prosperity. The capital at Luoyang became a glittering center of politics and culture. Aristocratic families rebuilt their fortunes, patronizing scholars, poets, and calligraphers. Agricultural lands ravaged during the Three Kingdoms were slowly restored, temples were built, rituals performed, and the imperial court claimed the mandate of heaven anew. Yet beneath this surface, fissures spread. The Jin court was dominated by powerful aristocratic clans, each vying for influence. Instead of strengthening the throne, Emperor Wu distributed land and titles lavishly to his relatives, creating a bloated nobility that drained resources and fueled rivalry. The bureaucracy, already swollen with competing interests, became paralyzed by corruption. The most destructive crisis came in the early 4th century. The War of the Eight Princes 291–306 CE. After Emperor Wu's death, his young heir, Emperor Hui, ascended the throne. Hui was mentally unfit to rule, leaving regents and princes to battle for control. Over 15 years, 8 imperial princes and their armies turned the empire into a battlefield. Cities were looted, fields burned, and millions displaced. The civil wars shattered what unity the Jin had briefly achieved, leaving the dynasty vulnerable to outside threats. Those threats came swiftly to the north and west. Nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples had long interacted with Chinese states, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, sometimes serving as mercenaries in Chinese armies. During the Han and later groups such as the Shangyu, Sham, Chong, and Di had settled inside China's frontiers. Under the strong hand of a unified state, they were manageable. Under the chaos of the Jin, they became a force of their own. In the early 4th century, these groups seized their chance. Formerly subordinate tribes rose in rebellion, carving out kingdoms across northern China. The most powerful of these were the Shanggu, who captured the Jin capital Luoyang in 311 CE, and then Qiangan in 316 CE, forcing Emperor Hai of Jin into captivity. Northern China fell into fragmentation with numerous non-Han kingdoms vying for dominance. This era, remembered as the 16 Kingdoms 300–439 CE, saw waves of invasion, shifting alliances, and the establishment of states by groups who had once lived on the margins of the Chinese world. The collapse of Jinyul in the north forced the dynasty to retreat. In 317 CE, surviving princes of the Sima family fled south of the Yangtze River, establishing the Eastern Qin Dynasty. 317–420 CE, with its capital at Jiangkong, modern Nanjing, though far weaker than the Han or the Western Qin. The Eastern Jin preserved a measure of legitimacy from their southern base. The emperors maintained a Chinese court, performed rituals, and claimed continuity with past dynasties. For many in the south, the Jin represented the cultural heart of China. Even as the north remained fractured, life under the Eastern Jin and the northern kingdoms was marked by dislocation, but also cultural transformation. Millions of refugees fled southward, carrying with them traditions of northern China, Confucian learning, courtly etiquette, and aristocratic lineages. In the south, they mingled with local populations, creating a new blend of cultures that would shape the lower Yangtze region for centuries. The south became a refuge of Chinese continuity, while the north became a cauldron of ethnic diversity and political experimentation. Religion also shifted dramatically in this era. Buddhism, introduced earlier along the Silk Road, took deep root during the centuries of division. The promise of salvation and release from suffering resonated in a world torn by war and instability. Monasteries spread across both north and south, supported by rulers and commoners alike. Buddhist monks translated scriptures from Sanskrit into Chinese, adapting the new faith to Chinese language and thought. Taoism also grew, developing organized religious movements that blended philosophy with ritual alchemy and a search for immortality. These spiritual currents reshaped Chinese society, offering hope amid disunity. The Jin and the 16 Kingdoms also left a legacy of literature and art. Aristocrats displaced from the north gathered in southern courts, producing poetry that spoke of exile, loss, and the longing for past glory. The famous 7 sages of the bamboo grove embodied this spirit. A group of intellectuals who retreated from politics to live simply, drinking wine, playing music, and writing poetry. Their works reflect both despair at political corruption and a search for personal freedom. Meanwhile, the northern kingdoms developed their own distinctive styles. Xiongnu, Shanbi, and other rulers adopted elements of Chinese administration, language, and culture. Even as they maintained their own traditions, they built cities, sponsored Buddhist temples, and engaged in diplomacy. Though often dismissed by later historians as barbarian regimes, these states played a crucial role in spreading Buddhism and integrating diverse peoples into the fabric of Chinese civilization. By the end of the 4th century, the Eastern Jin in the south survived precariously while the north remained fragmented. The dream of unity seemed distant, yet out of this division, a new synthesis was emerging. The Chinese world was no longer purely Hanin identity, but increasingly multiethnic and multicultural. Buddhism was no longer a foreign faith, but an integral part of spiritual life. The South was no longer peripheral, but a major cultural and political center. Thus, the Qin Dynasty and the northern invasions mark a turning point. The brief unity after the 3 kingdoms gave way to disunion. But in that disunion, China was remade. The cycles of collapse and renewal continued as they always had. But the cultural landscape was transformed in ways that would endure. The centuries of invasion and fragmentation that followed would test China's resilience. Yet from these trials, new dynasties would rise. New philosophies would flourish, and the continuity of Chinese civilization would prove itself once again. Ahead lay the Sui and Tang, dynasties that would reunite the land and bring Chinese culture to dazzling heights. But first, China would endure nearly 3 centuries of division, its spirit tempered by hardship and renewed through adaptation. Su's ambitious reunification. For nearly 3 centuries after the fall of the Western Jin, China remained divided. Dynasties rose and fell in the north, founded by non-Han peoples such as the Shang, while the south was governed by successive Chinese dynasties, continuing the legacy of the Eastern Qin. This was the time of the Northern and Southern dynasties 425 and 89 CE, a period of cultural fluorescence but political fragmentation. The North and South developed distinctive identities. The North hardened by warfare and shaped by nomadic traditions. The South refined by aristocratic culture and immersed in poetry, calligraphy, and Taoist retreats. Buddhism flourished across both, bridging the divide with its monasteries and teachings of salvation. Yet the dream of unity, deeply ingrained in Chinese memory since the Qin and Han, never vanished. It would take the determination and the ruthlessness of a new dynasty to achieve it. That dynasty was the Sui 581–618 CE. The Sui dynasty was born out of the north. By the late 6th century, the northern Zhou dynasty held sway over much of northern China. Into this court rose Yang Jian, a skilled general and political operator. In 581 CE, he seized power, declaring himself Emperor I of Sui. With his authority secure, Yang Jian turned to the great task that had eluded countless rulers for centuries: the reunification of North and South. In 589 CE, his armies marched against the Qin Dynasty, the last of the southern dynasties, whose capital was at Jiangkong, modern Nanjing. The Qin were weakened by corruption and internal strife, and their resistance collapsed. Sui forces crossed the Yangtze, captured Jiangkong, and ended centuries of division. After almost 300 years, China was once again united under a single dynasty. The reunification achieved by the Sui was more than military conquest. It was also an administrative and cultural consolidation. Emperor Wen imposed a highly centralized bureaucracy modeled partly on Qin efficiency, but softened by Confucian ideals. He revived the civil service examinations, testing officials on their knowledge of Confucian classics, thereby reducing the dominance of aristocratic families. Laws were codified, taxes regularized, and land was redistributed under the equal field system. Designed to ensure fairness and secure state revenue, these measures strengthened the dynasty's grip on power and laid the groundwork for the flourishing Tang dynasty that followed. Among the SU's most ambitious achievements was the construction of the Grand Canal, stretching eventually over 1,000 m. The canal linked the fertile Yangtze Basin of the south with the political centers of the north. It allowed grain from the southern provinces to be shipped efficiently to northern capitals, sustaining armies and populations. Beyond economic utility, the canal symbolized unity, a great artery binding disparate regions into one body. Its construction, however, demanded immense labor, with countless peasants conscripted to dig, haul, and build. Many perished, leaving bitterness even as the empire celebrated its achievement. Emperor Wen's reign was remembered for frugality, stability, and religious tolerance. A devout Buddhist, he supported monasteries and promoted Buddhism as a unifying moral force across the empire. At the same time, he respected Confucian traditions and Taoist practices, weaving together the three great strands of Chinese thought. His governance balanced severity with vision, securing the foundations of the dynasty. Yet the Sui's ambition soon overreached. Emperor Wen was succeeded by his son, Emperor Yang, r. 604–618 CE. A man of great energy but reckless extravagance, Yang Di inherited the powerful machinery his father had built. But he sought glory on a scale that strained the empire to breaking. Emperor Yang expanded the Grand Canal, completing vast stretches and using it to parade his power, sailing in magnificent dragon barges with entourages of officials and concubines. He commissioned massive building projects, including new palaces and expansions of the capital. These works impressed contemporaries with their scale, but exhausted the treasury and people most disastrously. Emperor Yang launched enormous military campaigns against the Korean kingdom of Goryeo in the early 7th century. Determined to extend Chinese authority across the Korean peninsula, he conscripted hundreds of thousands of men, sending them on grueling expeditions across mountains and rivers. The campaigns ended in failure with heavy losses of men and resources. Soldiers died not only in battle, but from disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Peasants forced from their fields to serve faced famine at home. Resentment spread rapidly. Heavy taxes, relentless labor demands, and military disasters fueled uprisings across the empire. Bandit leaders proclaimed themselves kings, and regional generals turned against the throne. In 618 CE, as rebellions engulfed the land, Emperor Yang was assassinated by his own ministers. The Zhou Dynasty, which had reunited China with such promise, collapsed after only 37 years of rule, though short-lived. The Zhou Dynasty's impact was profound. Its reunification of North and South ended centuries of division and re-established the vision of a single empire. Its reforms in law, land distribution, and bureaucracy created structures that endured into the Tang. And its greatest project, the Grand Canal, remained the lifeline of Chinese commerce for centuries, carrying rice, silk, and people across the empire. The Sui is often remembered as a dynasty of extremes. Emperor I, the frugal unifier who built foundations with wisdom and restraint. Emperor Yang, the extravagant dreamer, whose ambitions exceeded the capacity of his people to endure. Together, they embodied the tension between vision and overreach that haunts every empire. The fall of the Sui cleared the way for one of China's most illustrious dynasties. In the turbulence of rebellion, a new power rose from the northwestern frontier, led by the Li family. In 618 CE, Li Yuan declared himself emperor, founding the Tang Dynasty. Where the Sui had faltered, the Tang would triumph, presiding over an age of prosperity, culture, and international influence that would make China the envy of the medieval world. The Sui's ambitious reunification, though brief, was not in vain. It reset the course of history, reuniting a fractured land and creating the conditions for renewal. In its short flame, the Sui burned brightly, illuminating both the potential of empire and the dangers of overextension. Out of its ashes, the Tang would rise, carrying Chinese civilization to dazzling heights. Tang's flourishing cosmopolis. With the fall of the Sui in 618 CE, China once again faced rebellion, war, and uncertainty. Yet out of the turmoil, a dynasty emerged that would not only stabilize the empire, but elevate Chinese civilization to one of its greatest heights. This was the Tang Dynasty 618–907 CE, remembered as a golden age of cosmopolitan culture, political strength, and artistic brilliance. Where the Sui had overreached and collapsed, the Tang built wisely upon their foundations, creating an empire that became the beating heart of East Asia and a beacon of civilization admired far beyond its borders. The Tang was founded by Li Yuan, a general of noble background who seized power amid the collapse of the Sui. He declared himself Emperor Gao in 618, establishing his capital at Chang'an, modern Xi'an. Soon his son Li Shimin proved himself a brilliant strategist and statesman. After defeating rival warlords and even his own brothers in a bloody struggle, Li Shaman ascended the throne in 626 as Emperor Tang. His reign marked the true beginning of Tang greatness. Tang combined military skill with administrative wisdom. He reformed the bureaucracy, reducing corruption and improving the civil service examination system that had begun under the Han. He rewarded merit, not just birth, appointing capable officials who strengthened the state. He also codified laws into a system known as the Tang Code, a balanced mixture of Confucian ethics and legalist enforcement. The Tang Code became a model for East Asia, influencing Japan, Korea, and Vietnam for centuries. Militarily, the Tang extended China's reach farther than almost any dynasty before or since. Campaigns pushed into Central Asia, establishing Chinese influence along the Silk Road as far as modern-day Afghanistan. In the northeast, the Tang fought against the Goryeo Kingdom of Korea, while in the south they extended power into Vietnam. Envoys and merchants from as far as Persia, India, and Arabia arrived at the Tang court, bringing tribute and gifts. Chang'an became a hub of global exchange. One of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, the capital itself was a marvel. With a population exceeding 1 million at its height, Chang'an was a carefully planned city of wide boulevards, walled wards, bustling markets, and glittering palaces. Foreign merchants filled its bazaars, trading silk, porcelain, and tea for glassware, spices, and precious stones. Buddhist monks from India, Nestorian Christians from the Middle East, and Zoroastrians from Persia all found a place in the city. The mix of languages, foods, and fashions made Chang'an a cosmopolitan center unmatched in medieval Eurasia. Culturally, the Tang era produced some of China's greatest poetry and art. Poets like Li Bai and Du Fu wrote verses that captured both the grandeur of the empire and the fragility of human life. Li's soaring romanticism and Du Fu's sober reflections on war and hardship remain treasured in Chinese literature. Painters created landscapes that expressed both the vastness of nature and the solitude of the human spirit. Calligraphy was elevated to high art with masters like Yanzhenking setting standards still admired today. Music and dance influenced by Central Asia and beyond filled the courts with exotic rhythms and colors. Religion flourished in diversity. Buddhism reached its greatest influence with massive monasteries, pilgrimages, and translations of sacred texts. The monk Xuanzang, who traveled to India and returned with volumes of scriptures, became a symbol of Buddhist devotion and cross-cultural exchange. Taoism also thrived, especially since the Tang emperors claimed descent from Laozi, using Taoist legitimacy to bolster their rule. Confucianism remained the framework of the state, ensuring order and hierarchy. Even foreign religions like Manichaeism, Notorian Christianity, and Zoroastrianism found followers in Tangina, reflecting its openness to the wider world. The Tang Dynasty was not without challenges. In the mid-8th century, Emperor Xuanzong presided over the empire's peak, but also its most dangerous crisis. The Anlukan Rebellion 755–763 CE, and Lucan, a general of mixed Dayan and Turkish heritage, commanded massive armies on the northern frontier. He turned against the court, leading one of the largest uprisings in Chinese history. His forces captured Chang'an and Luoyang, forcing the emperor to flee. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed, it devastated the empire, costing millions of lives and weakening central authority. In the aftermath, the Tang never fully recovered its former strength. Regional governors known as Jidushi gained increasing autonomy, commanding their own armies and collecting taxes. The central government relied on them for defense, but their power eroded imperial control. Nevertheless, the Tang endured for another century and a half, continuing to produce cultural brilliance even as its political foundations weakened. The role of women in the Tang era also stands out in history. The most famous example is Empress Weitian r. 6975 CE, who declared herself emperor, the only woman in Chinese history to hold the title in her own right. Wu Zetian was a formidable ruler promoting Buddhism, strengthening the examination system and ruling with authority. Though vilified by some later Confucian historians, she was respected in her time for her ability to govern and her intelligence in navigating the dangerous politics of court. Tang women in general enjoyed more freedom than in later dynasties, participating in sports like polo, wearing elaborate fashions, and sometimes taking roles in politics and the arts. Even as the Tang weakened in its later centuries, its cultural impact remained immense. Chinese writing, law, and institutions spread to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, forming the basis of East Asia's shared civilization. Japan's Nara and Heian courts modeled themselves on Tang Chang'an, while Korea's Xia Dynasty adopted Tang-style institutions. The Tang Dynasty became a reference point not only for Chinese greatness but for the broader East Asian world. By the 9th century, internal struggles, corruption, and natural disasters strained the dynasty. The spread of powerful warlords, further fragmented authority, and peasant rebellions erupted. In 97 CE, the Tang Dynasty finally fell, replaced by a series of short-lived regimes in what became known as the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period. Yet, the Tang's legacy endured. It was remembered as an era when China was the center of the world, confident in its power and radiant in its culture. Poets, painters, monks, and merchants had flourished under its protection. Its laws and institutions provided models for centuries, and its cosmopolitan openness left a mark that continued to inspire even as later dynasties turned inward. Thus, the Tang Dynasty stands as one of the high points of Chinese history. It was a flourishing cosmopolis, a world where cultures met, where art and literature soared, and where the empire reached out confidently to the horizons of Asia. The Tang revealed what Chinese civilization could achieve at its fullest, and its memory became an enduring standard against which later dynasties would be measured. Tang decline, fragmentation. The Tang Dynasty had risen with brilliance, unified the empire, and made Chang'an the marvel of the medieval world. But empires, no matter how radiant, are not eternal. After centuries of power, the Tang gradually weakened. Its decline was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling, brought on by rebellion, decentralization, court intrigue, and the weight of empire itself. The story of Tang decline reveals how even a golden age can fracture and how resilience can give way to fragmentation. The first great shock came with the Anlushan Rebellion 755–763 CE, already introduced in the previous chapter but deserving fuller attention here. Anlukan, a frontier general of Sogdian and Turk descent, commanded massive armies along the northern borders. He was favored at court, especially by Emperor Xuanzong and the emperor's beloved consort Yang Gui. But ambition outweighed loyalty. In 755, Anlukian declared himself emperor of a new dynasty and marched his armies into the heart of China. His forces captured both Chang'an and Luoyang, forcing Xuanzong to flee south. In the chaos, the emperor's entourage turned against Yang Gui, blaming her family's influence for the disaster. Under pressure, Xuanzong ordered her execution, one of the most tragic and famous moments in Chinese cultural memory. The rebellion raged for years, devastating cities and countryside alike. By the time it was finally suppressed, tens of millions were dead, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Though the Tang Dynasty survived, it was never the same. Central authority was fatally weakened. To defeat Anlishan, the court had relied on regional military governors, the Jidushi, who commanded their own armies and controlled taxation in their provinces. After the rebellion, these governors became semi-independent warlords. They acknowledged the Tang emperor in name, but ruled their territories as personal domains. The dynasty endured, but power had shifted irreversibly away from the throne. In the later 8th and 9th centuries, the Tan court became a stage for endless intrigue. Eunuchs who controlled access to the emperor grew immensely powerful. At times, they dominated appointments, commanded palace troops, and even deposed emperors. Scholar officials resented their influence, while aristocrats struggled to reclaim power. The once orderly bureaucracy turned into a web of factions, each scheming for advantage. Economic strains compounded political weakness. The equal field system of land distribution, a hallmark of Tang governance, began to break down as aristocratic families and monasteries amassed large estates. Peasants lost land and fell into debt, fueling resentment. Heavy taxes to fund wars and caught luxuries further burdened commoners. Natural disasters from droughts to floods deepened the misery. For many, the dynasty no longer seemed to embody heaven's mandate. Religious life too reflected both vibrancy and tension. Buddhism, long supported by Tang emperors, reached extraordinary heights during this era. Monasteries owned vast tracts of land, sheltered peasants, and accumulated wealth. Monks traveled widely, translating scriptures and spreading devotion. Pilgrimages to sacred mountains flourished, and Buddhist art filled caves and temples with dazzling murals and statues. But this very success provoked backlash. Confucian officials argued that monasteries drained resources from the state and encouraged idleness. Taoists favored by the Tang imperial family resented Buddhist influence. The clash culminated in the Great Suppression of Buddhism. 845 CE under Emperor Wuzong. Thousands of monasteries were closed. Hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns forced to return to lay life and Buddhist lands confiscated. Though Buddhism survived and revived, the suppression revealed how fragile even the strongest institutions could be. When political winds shifted, foreign pressures also mounted along the Silk Road. The Tang lost influence after defeats against Tibetan and Arab forces in Central Asia. In 751 at the Battle of Talas, Tang troops were defeated by the Abbasid Caliphate, marking the limit of Chinese westward expansion. In the north, nomadic groups like the Uyghurs alternately allied with and threatened the dynasty, demanding tribute in exchange for military aid. China remained a great power, but it was increasingly hemmed in by external challenges. Despite these difficulties, the Tang continued to produce cultural brilliance. Poets like Du Fu and Boji chronicled the turmoil of the times, capturing both the grandeur of empire and the suffering of ordinary people. Painters turned their gaze inward, emphasizing the beauty of landscapes and the fragility of human existence. Calligraphers refined their art while music and dance at court retained their cosmopolitan richness. Even in decline, Tang culture glowed with vitality. By the late 9th century, however, rebellion returned with renewed force. The most devastating was the Huangchao Rebellion. 874–884 CE, a massive peasant uprising led by a salt merchant who turned against oppressive taxes and corrupt officials. His armies swept across the empire, sacking both Chang'an and Luoyang. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed, the Tang was fatally weakened. The dynasty lingered on for 2 more decades, but its authority was hollow. In 97 CE, The last Tang emperor was forced to abdicate and China fragmented into regional kingdoms in what became known as the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period 97–960 CE. For half a century, rival regimes rose and fell. Warlords carved out territories and the dream of unity faded once again. Yet the Tang's legacy could not be erased. Even as it collapsed, its cultural achievements remained unparalleled. Its legal code influenced East Asia for centuries. Its poetry became the standard of literary excellence. Its openness to the world left a memory of cosmopolitan exchange that later dynasties alternately emulated and rejected. In the Chinese imagination, the Tang endured as one of the brightest ages, remembered not for its decline, but for its flourishing heights. Thus, the Tang Dynasty, radiant and turbulent, reveals the paradox of history. Its greatness was real, but so was its fragility. Its cosmopolitan brilliance dazzled, but its political foundations eroded. In its fall, it prepared the way for new experiments in governance, new syntheses of culture, and eventually new dynasties that would seek to recover the grandeur it once embodied. Song's scholar officials. The fall of the Tang in 97 CE ushered in a